Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the 21st episode of the Afghan Eye Podcast. I am Sangar Paykhar.
And I'm Ahmed-Waleed Kakar.
And this episode, we are critically examining a report that has been published by the Afghanistan Study Group.
And the Afghanistan Study Group is essentially a team or a committee that was formed at the behest of the United States Congress to make policy recommendations, obviously, with regard to Afghanistan. But that report was released on the 3rd of February. We'll get into it. We'll dissect it, deconstruct it, talk about its benefits, the pluses and the minuses. But before we do that, a quick announcement. If you are not subscribed to our YouTube channel, please do so. Click the button. You'll get notifications as and when we upload new content. If you don't follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, yeah, those are the ones. Please do so because we also share our content on there. And lastly and finally, our Patreon and our PayPal links are in the bio. In the description. I've spent too long on social media. Yeah. I've spent too long on like Twitter and whatever. I'm still new to describing it. And for those that weren't aware, we received a massive donation a couple of days ago. Those that follow us on Twitter will have seen it. And with that, I'm sure you can see there's sort of a change in our layout and the format of this video, which I hope everyone will like and appreciate. And if you want to further help us, just go. Doesn't have to be too much. And if money is tight and, there's the coronavirus and, you can't help out financially, sharing our content will always, that will always be the primary mode of help that you can give us.
One last thing for the people who are listening to the podcast, please do leave a review and 5 stars so that we can reach more people.
Yeah, you guys are giving us 4 and 5 stars, which I love, but there's no actual comment there. Come on, guys. Yeah. If you could, I don't know if everyone's being lazy or whatever, but if you could actually leave a comment, that would be much appreciated as well.
So now that we have that out of the way, the Afghanistan Study Group, what can you tell us about this initiative, Waleed?
So the Afghanistan Study Group is a group studying Afghanistan. No, but it's essentially, like I said, it's a committee that's been patronized and founded by Congress. It was created in December 2019, and essentially it gives policy recommendations to members of Congress with on matters pertaining to Afghanistan. It's quite a few characters that sit in that committee in the Afghanistan Study Group, either as just standard members or as co-chairs. And recently, on the 3rd of April, which isn't too long ago, just a couple of days ago, they published a report that a lot of people have been talking about, essentially giving policy recommendations to the new administration of Joe Biden as to how to approach the situation currently in Afghanistan, the US's role in it, in the aftermath of the Doha Deal, which the US under President Trump signed with the Taliban almost a year ago.
Yes, and it is very significant because based on this very important document that is essentially advising the US Congress and the new Biden administration, new decisions will be made in Washington, D.C. with regards to the ongoing peace process in Afghanistan and how the United States is going to continue it's either continue the war in Afghanistan or totally disengaged. We will go and dive into that later, but a few points. This report has been received overwhelmingly very positively by many figures in Afghanistan and outside Afghanistan, and obviously
I wonder why.
Yeah, a very significant person who was very delighted to see this report being published is the Vice President of Afghanistan, Amrullah Saleh. He tweeted, "We highly welcome the report, which is more nuanced than the title given to it. It asks wisdom and deliberation, not impulsive and rush decisions." Now, when you hear that,
and we'll get into why it probably wasn't a good idea for Vice President Amrullah Saleh to tweet that. But of course, just as with anything, for those of us that are observers or analysts or researchers in Afghanistan, we've observed since the beginning of the Biden administration, there's been sort of an emphasis on rebuilding alliances perceived to have decayed under President Trump. And there's also been talk of the new Secretary of State Blinken speaking to members of the Afghan government, talking about reviewing the Doha Deal. So reviewing is obviously a vague word. It's a word that has been a source of happiness, of hope for many, maybe not many, but quite a few people. And it's been a source of concern for others. And this report needs to be viewed in the context of that, because this report is essentially giving policy recommendations as to how to approach the how to approach Afghanistan, in the context of this Doha deal. So the long and short story of it, we'll get into it later on. The long and short story of it is that the report is basically arguing that the May 2021 deadline for full and total US troop withdrawal in May 2021, that deadline should be immediately extended, and it should be that troop withdrawal should only occur in the instance that the Taliban meet their commitments that they made under the Doha deal, which this report is accusing them of not having done so. So that is the long and short of it. The postponement of the deadline for withdrawal is obviously something that certain factions or parties or individuals will be happy about. That's what we know that the report has argued. But I want to take a detour and actually focus first on what the report has called inadvisable. So there are three pathways that the report has discussed, and it's mentioned that these are inadvisable routes for the Biden administration to follow. The first of all is, the understanding of the report is that the presence of US troops in Afghanistan is the US's main leverage. As in the negotiating table with the Taliban, the one thing that the US can use to extract concessions from the Taliban is the presence of its troops. Okay? Now, in that context, the report has basically said that there are three inadvisable steps. Number one is a recommittal to the state. And they mean the Afghan state. So a recommittal to the Afghan state, whereby basically return to the status quo prior to the signing of the pre-peace agreement. And I'm going to quote verbatim here. This would mean, and I quote directly, recommitting to the existing constitutional order, continuing to support the Afghan state, continuing to disrupt terrorist networks, and continuing to maintain military pressure on the Taliban to create improved conditions for either an eventual withdrawal through a stronger Afghan state or a new negotiation with the Taliban from a more advantageous position. And the report says that this, so basically a return to the status quo disregarding the Doha deal is inadvisable because there's no actual time scale as to how the goal would be achieved of eventually getting the Taliban to the negotiating table or strengthening the Afghan government. And on top of that, of course, there's the coronavirus. The US has been pretty devastated in the impact of the coronavirus. This would cost roughly about $20 billion a year. And on top of that, if the US were to essentially recommit to the Afghan state, it would really remove any incentive from the politicians of the Afghan state to negotiate with the Taliban in good faith. And of course, there's the factor that the Taliban refused to recognize and continue to refuse to recognize the Afghan state for the last 19 years. So going back to that arrangement offers absolutely no guarantee that the Taliban would suddenly have a change of heart and decide to recognize the Afghan state. Number two, the second pathway that the report says is inadvisable is essentially adhering to the Doha Deal. So the report is saying that adhering to the current Doha Deal, which it calls a calculated military withdrawal, leaving whilst prioritizing US interests and mitigating risks with non-military means. This is inadvisable. And the reason it's inadvisable is because it's dangerous, there's a potential for a civil war, and prioritizing US interests, well, US interests are ill-defined, even if these are achieved through non-military means. And finally, the Afghan government, quite simply, even according to the report, is too weak and divided, as opposed to the Taliban, which give all of the signals that they are not weak and that they are not divided. Now, my main critique of this would be that the report says this could lead to civil war and fighting. Newsflash, there already is a civil war and fighting. So it's not really going to change in terms of the political dynamics of the country. And the third route that the US is saying is inadvisable. Sorry, the US is not saying that this route is inadvisable. The Afghanistan Study Group is saying this is inadvisable, is washing of the hands, a prompt military withdrawal and diplomatic disengagement. So that's basically get the hell out of Afghanistan and just leave them to do whatever they do. The report is saying this is inadvisable because it's risky, it's dangerous. There'll be there'll be a civil war reminiscing the 90s in which, this will become regionalized. There'll be a danger of radicalization, with which I agree, to be honest. And I don't just mean religious radicalization, but just a really deep polarization of the internal demographics of Afghan society, which would, those fault lines would become more pronounced, hardened, and everyone would become more entrenched. So those are the three things, Sangar, that the report is saying should not be done. And before I go on to what the report actually says should be done, I'm going to forfeit the stage and see if you have any questions you'd like to ask whilst I have my chai.
Well, okay. First of all, the three pathways that they are describing that are inadvisable, if you see that the way the Taliban have responded to this report is basically threatening to go back to the previous state of affairs where they were in an all-out war against foreign troops. I see in the last few days, if you monitor social media, all these Taliban linked channels on social media, they're pumping all these videos and images and threatening texts, basically warning the United States and its allies that if you are going to walk back from the Doha deal, then it means war, it means the same situation prior to the start of the negotiations. And personally, I think that if you see how these three pathways are described, it is actually anticipated. So basically, you could argue that they are also communicating towards the Taliban by saying, like, or even though we are going to say that we want the soldiers to stay longer in Afghanistan, that's not what we want. We don't want to start fighting you again, and we are not staying in Afghanistan. So there seems to be some miscommunication on the Afghan part. Both the Taliban and the government, they both seem to have trouble understanding what is being said here. First of all, we see Vice President Amrullah Saleh welcoming this report as if it is saying exactly what he wants to hear. And we see Taliban stern warning that if you don't stick by what we have agreed on, then there will be a all-out war. So I think that...
Yeah, and it's also worth noticing that alongside the threats of war, they've also been traveling quite a bit as well. They went to Russia, and in Russia, I believe it was Sher Sheikh Mohammed Abbas Stanagzai, who said that if the Americans don't withdraw from Afghanistan, we'll continue to kill Americans. Mullah Bradar and a couple of other members of the Taliban political office were in Turkmenistan today. They also visited Iran. So they're essentially flexing their muscles in terms of their Telegram channels where they're threatening war, as well as the fact that they're also showing their diplomatic clout, where they're going to all of these countries and showing that they have, good or at least cordial relations with these different countries. So the PR offensive, since the ambiguity has arisen over the status of the Doha deal as a result of Biden's victory, the PR offensive has been very, very noticeable.
Yes, and what this current situation is basically, the best way to describe it is that, say that the United States decides to totally cancel the Doha deal and walk back on all the agreements that they have made with the Taliban. What has happened is that the Taliban, over the last 2 years, they have gained legitimacy on an international level. They are now a political entity that has its own relationship with the neighboring countries. The Doha Agreement of February 2021 was officially endorsed by the United Nations Security Council. So there is no way back for the Taliban, because they have achieved so much after the agreement that even if this deal is cancelled, they have been empowered by this whole situation. They have achieved a new status as a political entity. And I think this is also one of the reasons why in the three pathways, as you have very clearly explained, the Afghanistan Study Group are aware that there is no way back. They have to build and go forwards. So now that we have discussed these three pathways that are inadvisable, let's just dive into the main document. What are the...
Before we do that, actually, so we've spoken about what is inadvisable, okay? We'll speak about what the Afghanistan Study Group has recommended. However, whilst I have pretty strong reservations and disagreements with the report and its conclusions, I also want to talk about some of the positives that I took from the report. So the report is pretty refreshing in the sense that there are a number of points that are made in the report, a number of assertions that are made, a number of points that are made that Afghan researchers, observers, commentators have been saying for ages, but in saying those things, they've been derided as terrorists, Taliban sympathizers, or Niktai Porsche Taliban or whatever. So for me personally, it's very refreshing. It's reinvigorating to see that the Afghanistan Study Group, whose work is commissioned by none other than the US Congress, is saying the same thing that we've been saying for years. I mean, maybe I haven't been saying them for years, or we haven't been doing it on Afghan Eye, but the opinions that certain critics of the Afghan government have had for years have been vindicated by this report. And these were facts. These were known. We knew these things all along, but because we weren't white and our names didn't end in Thompson or whatever, and we belonged to the wrong religion, it was all too easy to smear these people as being terrorists. Now, let me give you some examples, and I'm going to quote directly verbatim here. Afghans have deeply held traditions of popular consultation, conflict management, and political legitimation that have existed long before electoral politics became the norm. Customary practices and the social organization associated with them may well be part of a credible governing formula in Afghanistan. Processes and institutions that are locally anchored and sustainably maintained will be most likely to succeed as the country enters this new chapter of state building. Why is this relevant or significant for me? Because one of the things that I've noticed in the coverage of the last 19 years is that we need a copy-paste model where we get, all of these political models that are, formed in the West through their own unique evolution and geopolitics. We copy and paste that to Afghanistan because, we'll progress. And that progress, I'm sorry, has been pretty disappointing. Whoever disagrees with me and is offended by that, I apologize in advance, but it is what it is. But the point is that Afghans are not savages, right? In a country like Afghanistan, I forgot which scholar actually said this. I referenced it in my dissertation. Afghanistan is sort of the kind of territory that lies on the front line between two empires. And in a country like Afghanistan, where a strong central government has traditionally been absent, human beings, anthropologists will tell you the same thing. They come up with their own mechanisms, independent of strong, powerful states, where they can, resolve conflicts with one another, or they can come to some sort of peacemaking agreements. There are traditions. These people govern their affairs in a way in which they have for centuries in the absence of a strong central state. So the point is that Afghans are not savages. They are very much capable, as they have been for centuries, to sort of have their own practices at the local level, which would be more responsive to local needs. So the second quote, Sangar, another one that I found refreshing, reinvigorating. It was honest. It was something we all knew, but once again, we need the Afghanistan Study Group to certify it. And I quote directly, "The Taliban are not an international terrorist organization, and there is no evidence that they have any intention to attack the United States. In the 2020 US Taliban agreement, the Taliban explicitly promised to neither host nor allow Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups to support, recruit, train, or fundraise in Afghanistan, or to attack other countries from Afghan soil. The Taliban do, however, accept assistance from Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. It remains to be seen how vigorously the Taliban will clamp down on the presence of these organizations and their activities on Afghan territory. From late 2020, the steady rhythm of terror attacks in Kabul and across the country suggests a disinclination or inability on the group's part to restrain the use of terror, either by its own members or by others." Now, the Taliban are not Al-Qaeda. Who would have known, right? Radical idea. Yeah. But there we go. The Americans are saying...
This raises a question. So if the Afghanistan Study Group says that the Taliban are not a terrorist organization like Al-Qaeda, what does it mean when we see repeatedly in Afghanistan the government referring to Taliban as terrorists? What does it mean when the Afghan media, the journalists, the commentators, that when they constantly refer to the Taliban as terrorist equal to Daesh and other groups?
Al-Qaeda. Well, I mean, the thing is that one of the sort of features that I've observed is that since 2001, the word terrorist has become stripped of all of its meaning. It doesn't mean anything anymore. Anyone and everyone is a terrorist. Because the definition of terrorism, don't quote me on this directly, it's using violence to achieve a political end. Well then, who is not a terrorist?
By a non-state actor.
By a non-state
actor.
So
use of violence for a political end by a non-state actor. Now,
and does the definition refer to targeting civilians?
Obviously. Now, by that definition,
so then we could say that many groups in Afghanistan that fight on the side of the Afghan government, they fit that definition perfectly.
Like all these militias, all these CIA-backed militias in Afghanistan, they're non-state actors. They don't fall under the state's military apparatus, but these groups, they operate as paramilitary groups. They're trained and they're backed by the United States or powerful figures in Afghanistan, and they are basically doing what best could be described as terrorism. So yes, terrorism and labeling people as terrorists is a political decision. It is a way to delegitimize the claims of your opponent. Now, if the Afghanistan Study Group is concluding that the Taliban are not terrorists,
in their, I don't want to say in their defense, but what they have said is the Taliban are not an international terrorist group. So that means that they are confirming the Taliban's interests lie only within the borders of the Afghan state. However, language is a funny thing, okay? In the 2020 US Taliban agreement, the Taliban explicitly promised to neither host nor allow Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups to support, recruit, train, or fundraise in Afghanistan. So Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups.
Yes.
So the Taliban are being mentioned in a completely separate category, which is implicitly indicating that the Afghanistan Study Group does not consider the Taliban to be the same as Al-Qaeda and the other groups whom it refers to as terrorists, without actually saying the Taliban are not terrorists.
Yeah.
So it's implicit in its tone, but the point is being made there anyways.
And again, this document was endorsed by Amrullah Saleh.
There we go. Of course.
I think I have to remind our listeners and viewers
because it's not a small deal. It's not a small deal. Like, it's not a caricature or something. The Vice President of Afghanistan was delighted with this report, and he was so delighted he tweeted it. Like, for example, Ashraf Ghani did not tweet anything. Okay, Amrullah Saleh did. Now, quote number 3, and this is the final quote, is, and I quote, "One component of the Taliban is the Haqqani Network, notorious for its ability to organize asymmetric attacks in urban areas that have killed hundreds of civilians, including foreigners. The Taliban are distinct from Al-Qaeda and its affiliates and do not support its global jihadi agenda, but retain close ties to the group and have refused to disavow it. Differing opinions exist as to whether the Taliban are monolithic, fragmented, or susceptible to fragmentation. Despite the current negotiations in Doha, there are clearly some Taliban commanders who favor securing a military victory rather than a negotiated settlement. Despite internal disagreements, the Taliban remain the most coherent and disciplined political military group in Afghanistan." So firstly, there are a couple of things to unpack here. One component of the Taliban is the Haqqani Network. Okay, we were told, I remember this was about 2008, 2013, that the Haqqanis were they were basically the ISI's pet project, and they were also Al-Qaeda. There were all sorts of these disagreements and whatever. So this is the Afghanistan Study Group writing down quite veritably that the Haqqani Network, of course, the Taliban would deny that such a thing exists. But the reason the Haqqani Network is known as such is that the organization's existence predates the founding of the Taliban. The Haqqani Network, or its predecessor, was operating in the 70s, whereas the Taliban was formed in the mid-90s. But here you have it. The Afghanistan Study Group is basically verifying that the Haqqani Network is, as of this moment in time, part of the Taliban. Okay, once again, the Taliban are distinct from Al-Qaeda, do not support global jihadi agenda. So that means they are not a terrorist group. And there's the statement that despite internal disagreements, the Taliban remain the most coherent and disciplined political military group in Afghanistan. Sangar, how many times did we hear that there is not just one Taliban, there are 10 different Taliban? And Mullah Omar is just basically a cartoon character. And all of these different factions, they all fight with each other. And it's impossible for us, the poor Afghan government, to secure our country against all of these hundreds of different Taliban factions. That narrative, according to the patron of Kabul's government, is now rendered null and void. Once again, we come back to Amrullah Saleh. If, for example, Amrullah Saleh does come out with something saying that Al-Qaeda is the same thing as the Taliban, or the Taliban are global international terrorists, or that the Haqqanis are separate, or that the Taliban are fragmented into different factions, if those sorts of statements are made by Amrullah Saleh, again, he is verifiably contradicting himself, because he just endorsed a report that essentially confirmed otherwise. Okay? And the reason I use the word confirm, I use it very carefully, because once again, according to Amrullah Saleh, this is the gold standard. This is the report of all reports. Okay? Those are, I would say, the quotes that I found refreshing. I found, to basically, it seems that in our part of the world, we need a white guy from DC to confirm what we knew a decade ago. But, in Farsi, there's a saying that says, "Der ayat durust ayat." Okay? It's okay if it comes late as long as it comes correct. So that's essentially my stance towards some of the assertions that this report has made.
I do see that there is a current development in Afghanistan. Afghan National Security Advisor Hamdullah Mohib has been giving lectures and talks everywhere. He is basically being bellicose. He's like all war language and fight. Other prominent figures from the government have made similar statements like, we're going to fight, we're going to go all the way, and we're not it doesn't seem like they have grown more mature and that they have developed an inclination towards peace. It's quite the opposite. So I think that that could be due to this report, but it could also be that they are just retaliating after recent statements by the Taliban, because they have made similar statements. However, I want to ask you, so first of all, this important aspect of this report is that it basically saying that the withdrawal of troops and the finalization of the process on the in May of 2020, that this needs to be renegotiated. Before we even go any further, do you agree with that? Why not?
No. Because once you put the signature of the president of the state on the agreement and the Secretary of State, you have to abide by it. Unless, of course, the other group also comes to an understanding to renegotiate. But if the other group is saying that this was the peace deal, and if you violate our peace deal, there will be an absence of peace, which is war, then, this is the thing is that the fact of the matter is that the Taliban are a non-state actor. So there are certain standards and ideals to which they are not accountable. Okay? If the Taliban do not allow, let's say, free press, for example, it's not as much a blemish on their legitimacy as it is, for example, if the United States were to do the same thing. Why? Because the US is a state. It believes in, the rule of law, multilateralism, honoring all of these agreements. It's beholden to a higher standard of state etiquette. So if the US were to embark upon this sort of revisionist understanding of the Doha Deal, which clearly stipulated in no uncertain terms that whilst there were uncertainties and ambiguities in the agreement, one of the key and the most clear parts of the agreement was the US will withdraw every last soldier it has in May 2021. So that's not even from the pro-American perspective, it's a blemish on their credibility. And also, I don't agree with it purely on the basis that whilst the intra-Afghan negotiations happening right now happened as a result of the Doha Deal. The Doha Deal stipulated the steps that paved the way for the intra-Afghan negotiations that are currently ongoing, or maybe they're going through a break. But the fact that they're negotiating is a direct result of that agreement. So if that agreement is being scrapped, then the essence for the intra-Afghan negotiations also evaporates, and we're back to square one.
That both negotiating teams can withdraw. The negotiating team of the Afghan government, who allegedly receive $14,000 salaries every month for the duration of the negotiations, they will have to just go back to Kabul and do whatever they were doing before that.
Terrible news for them. I wouldn't want to lose out on that.
Yeah.
But but those are. What would you say, Sangar? Would you say it's a positive? How would you say the argument is that the May 2021 deadline is premature? It needs to be extended. What do you say?
I think that extending it will not result to less fighting. So you see, when a measure is being introduced to solve a problem, the measure by itself, like we have in Islamic jurisprudence, we have a principle that says that if there is something that needs to be resolved, if there is a problem, some kind of harm to society and people, the measure that you are going to introduce to solve that problem cannot and must not be more harmful. So, for instance, if somebody is burning, if suppose you're cooking and your sweater catches fire, in order to make sure that you survive and you don't die, people can't just go and drown you in an ice cold sea, because obviously the fire will be. Yeah, it's because
I like the example.
It's very cold right now.
I like the example.
It's freezing outside, so
okay.
The solution cannot be more harmful than the problem itself. So if the United States, if they decide to renegotiate the deal, they're basically saying the Doha deal needs to be cancelled. Okay, you after months of traveling back and forth, Zalmay Khalilzad, he traveled like 20 times back and forth.
Imagine how many CO2 emissions went into the atmosphere.
And the Biden administration is committed to all these new environmental so that's a big waste. But anyway, I think that they should they should stick to what they have agreed on, but they should look at root causes of why the negotiation is not resulting into a desirable outcome so far. That's what needs to be investigated, in my opinion. Anyway, let's continue.
So we have now discussed what the report considers inadvisable.
Yes.
Okay, the 3 pathways. Those were just washing your hands of Afghanistan was one. Adhering to the Doha deal was the other, and going back to the status quo prior to the Doha deal was the other. Those 3, according to the study group, were inadvisable. We've discussed the admissions of reality that we all knew for years, finally coming from the US as well. Those were good things. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go into what does the report actually suggest. Okay. Now we've already discussed that it suggests postponing the deadline of May 2021 for withdrawing troops. Now let's go into that in a lot more detail. So the study group makes 5 recommendations. Okay. Number 1 is clarify the end state. Number 2 is reinforce the conditionality of a final US troop withdrawal. Number 3, clarify the US commitment to the current Afghan state. Number 4, work diplomatically to promote the success of the negotiation process. And number 5, design an overarching regional diplomacy. Now, I'm going to go into each of those 5 recommendations in a bit more depth. So what they mean when they say clarify the end state is the US should make it very and unambiguously clear as to what they want, what they desire Afghanistan to look like as a result of these negotiations. And that is, and I quote, an independent, democratic and sovereign Afghan state. An Afghan state that supports and protects minorities, women's rights, the democratic nature of the state, and a free press, but that could include Taliban figures. So once again, independent, democratic, sovereign, an Afghan state that supports and protects minorities, women's rights, democracy, free press, as well as being able to accommodate actual Taliban figures. Now, I don't know if these guys have read the current Afghan constitution. What they are describing is essentially the current Afghan constitution. But now there is a contradiction in that, and there is a big, inherent, massive, logical fallacy in that. And that is that they also say that the withdrawal of US troops should be conditional on, and I quote, the Taliban's demonstrated willingness and capacity to contain terrorist groups, a reduction in the Taliban's violence against the Afghan people, and on real progress toward a compromised political settlement. So one of the conditions that the study group is stipulating is a compromised political settlement. Now, why is that a problem? Well, a compromised political settlement, if the Taliban were to say, okay, we don't like democracy, we need to get rid of democracy, what does that mean? Because if they are insisting that Afghanistan be an independent, democratic and sovereign state, and that the Taliban should come to a compromised political agreement, well, a compromised political agreement could be a non-democratic state. So where does the Afghanistan Study Group's priority lie in this? Is it a compromised political settlement, or is it an independent, democratic and sovereign Afghan state? Because it's very possible that you cannot have both at the same time. Okay? And another thing that I also want to point out is that I myself, for quite a while, have believed that the current Afghan state, the way that it's structured, cannot meaningfully be called a democracy. And in a podcast episode we did a couple of episodes earlier, we did a review of Barnett Rubin's book, where we also said that he basically said that whilst there were elements of the democratic process in the Afghan state, it could not be meaningfully called a democracy. And I would also go further to say that anyone that believes that Afghanistan is actually logistically capable of being a democracy is very uninformed about Afghanistan, its politics, its infrastructure, and whatever. It's practically, don't want to say impossible, it's extremely difficult for the Afghan government, its current civil bureaucracy, to organize a democratic election. And that is why every election since 2009 has been fraudulent, or has been called fraudulent by independent observers. So the insistence that the future Afghan state is democratic does not take into account the fact that there aren't even roads going into many parts of the country. It takes absolute months to be able to count all of these votes, and absolute months is quite a nice time to basically tamper with those votes. So that is the logical fallacy here. An independent, sovereign, democratic Afghan state and the Taliban have to come to a compromised political settlement. So if the Afghan government and the Taliban agree that, okay, fine, democracy is not working for us, which there is a case to be made, it isn't, okay, just the way it is. If the Afghan government and the Taliban come to that agreement, that contradicts the end state that the Afghanistan Study Group is advocating for.
I would say that in their defense, and in defense of the study group, is that they are basically, in this particular quote that you have just read, basically they are saying that the Taliban, they are the only ones who need to make concessions.
Yeah. Which leads to the next point. Number 2 of the 5 recommendations are to reinforce the conditionality of a final US troop withdrawal. And the report states, I quote, "A report issued by the United Nations in May 2020 observed that relations between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda remain close." So what the Afghanistan Study Group is saying here is that there should not be a fixed time limit on US troop withdrawal. The time should not be the basis on which troops are withdrawn, but the Taliban meeting certain conditions should be what the US bases its troop withdrawal on. Now, and those conditions, of course, are those that are stipulated by the Doha Deal, such as a reduction in violence, such as cutting ties with Al-Qaeda and all of these terrorist groups. The problem with that, however, is that it implies that the failure to adhere to the Doha Deal is only something that the Taliban are responsible of. And yeah, what do you say about that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, because this argument is entirely based on a report published in May of 2020. Okay, so the report that they are referring to is a report issued by UN Sanctions Monitoring Team for Al-Qaeda and Daesh. It's a monitoring team that monitors all these sanctioned terrorist organizations, and the intel that is provided to that monitoring team in order for it to publish its reports comes from the member states. Now, who are these member states in this particular case? Afghanistan. And which institution in Afghanistan provides such intel? The National Directorate of Security. So, if
an institution in which Amrullah Saleh has a lot of influence.
The current head of NDS, I think his name is Ziya Sarraj. He's a very close confidant of Amrullah Saleh. And this particular report was published in May of 2020. Okay? So the Doha Deal was signed in February of 2020. In May, this report was issued. Okay? So now, almost a year later, the Afghanistan Study Group is making an argument that the Taliban are not abiding by the Doha Deal. They have not broken their ties with Al-Qaeda. And in order to prove that, they are referring to a document from last year. Okay? So by May of 2020...
A document from last year which referenced the National Director of Security.
So by May of 2020, the Taliban were supposed to meet this requirement. But on the other hand, if you look at the Doha Deal, it was a deal between the United States and the Taliban. Both sides had their obligations, their commitments, but did the United States fulfill all its commitments by due dates? No, because even the prisoners, the Taliban prisoners, weren't released. Yeah, they were.
5,000.
It was a major point in the deal.
They were supposed to be released on March. They were supposed to be released before March the 10th, at which time the negotiations were meant to formally start. And I remember that from the agreement.
Yeah, so those prisoners weren't even released. The prisoners weren't released. So this report is basically arguing that only the Taliban had obligations. That this is very problematic. And now, coming to NDS. See, the thing is that the United States and its allies, they have created the National Directorate for Security in Afghanistan. It is basically a reincarnation of Khad. Khad was the National Directorate of Security under the communist regime. And this institution is mentioned in various reports as a violator of human rights. It is accused of assassinating civilians all over the country. It is torturing people. So it doesn't abide by any standard of international law, international human rights, anything. Yet the UN bases its report on intel coming from this organization. And now the Afghanistan Study Group is on its turn relying on a report by the UN that relies on a organization like NDS that is involved in torturing people. Like even the other day, I read that NDS, when they imprison people, they threaten them and they say, we are going to rape your female family members. You know, this is the kind of organization that is the NDS. And this organization is providing the intel to the UN and subsequently to Afghanistan Study Group. So you can see clearly that we have a major issue with this report and its findings and its conclusions, because if you're going to write 88 pages and your most important critique on which you are going to basically argue that the Doha deal needs to be cancelled is based on the NDS, then I'm sorry, but I'm not convinced.
And you're also you're commissioned by the United States Congress, like, without using big words. Come on, man, do better. But in any case, there's also another issue that I have with this, and it's from the quote that I mentioned previously. Withdrawal is conditional on the Taliban's demonstrating willingness and capacity to contain terrorist groups. Okay? And then it says that relations are close. So the Taliban have essentially, according to the text of the agreement, agreed that they will not let Al-Qaeda fundraise, operate, train, basically, I'm not going to, but I've mentioned it earlier, right? Now, relations remain close, according to that report, which relied on the NDS. What does close mean? And at which stage are we like, okay, this is a desirable level of closeness? At which stage does it get too close? Where is the empirical sort of standard? What is the benchmark by which we judge the Taliban have overstepped their closeness to Al-Qaeda? For instance, you have to be very specific about that. You could say there is a signal group chat of all terrorists, and you see a notification: Taliban have left the chat. Yeah, and then take a screenshot and give it to the Afghanistan Study Group. Like, look, they left the chat. They're no longer. So that's point number 2. So number 3. So we've already discussed that number 2 is to reinforce the conditionality of a final US troop withdrawal. The argument being that the Taliban have not abided by the conditions of the Doha Deal, which included not being close to Al-Qaeda, which this UN report stated it was being too close to Al-Qaeda. So essentially, the Taliban are too close to Al-Qaeda, whatever close means, and therefore the conditions have not been upheld, and the deadline of May 2021 is premature. Number 3 is clarify the US's commitment to the current Afghan state. Number 1 is support core Afghan state institutions. Number 2 is support civil society, Afghan civil society, of course. Number 3 is continue to give aid, humanitarian aid wherever needs arise. Number 4 is security assistance. Now, so supporting Afghan civil society, and the report says, emphasize and continue the tradition of US support for Afghan civil society groups that promote the shared values of democracy, human and women's rights, and free media. Okay, now, there is a bit of a problem here. Like you mentioned, Sangar, the NDS has been accused by numerous sources of actually targeting the same members of civil society that the US is saying, the Afghanistan Study Group is saying the US should support. How do you support both of those? Because it's also saying, the report is also saying that there should be security assistance. So you're essentially extending assistance to agencies like the NDS that are accused of suppressing Afghan society, who you are also duty and honor bound to support. There's a massive circle here, and this report is trying to square it. Number two is the fact that there's the call to support core state institutions like, for example, the Ministry of Health and whatever. But there's another caveat here, and I quote directly. This is talking about the Afghan government. The government has complained about not being able to have more control over funding in Afghanistan, claiming that donors are undermining the state's ability to set and implement its own priorities, but has done little to address the corruption problem that often drives these decisions. So the Afghanistan Study Group is on the one hand saying that the Afghan state's incapacity to, rectify corruption is a problem, and it's also saying that we should support the same state. Sorry, what? Like that doesn't make any sense. If we just look at the way in which the Afghan government is described in this report, it's 88 pages. Some of the descriptions are, and I quote, some of the descriptions associated with the Afghan government are, and I quote, huge corruption, ineffective, short-sighted, corrupt, divided, distant from the Afghan people, predatory governance, warlordism, an extremely uneven ability of the government to provide effective justice services and resolve disputes that have delegitimized the existing government, and legal institutions have enabled corruption rather than fostered justice. So on what grounds is the Afghanistan Study Group saying that the Afghan state and its institutions should be supported, whilst at the same time it's making these sorts of statements about the Afghan government? And once again, we come to Amrullah Saleh. We highly welcome the report, which is more nuanced than the title given to it. It asks wisdom and deliberation, not impulsive and rushed decisions. This is the vice president of the same government that has been called corrupt 20 times in an 88-page report. That's essentially like being called corrupt once every 4 pages. That is a lot. Okay, that's more than the Taliban have been called brutal. Okay, so if this is the opinion of the writers of the report on the Afghan government, on what ground should the Afghan government continue to be supported? And we come back to Amrullah Saleh. This is not the first own goal that Amrullah Saleh has scored. Whenever Amrullah Saleh equates the Taliban with Al-Qaeda and Daesh, whilst it resonates well with his base, it's actually an own goal, because if the Taliban are the same as Daesh, well, why the hell are you negotiating with them in Qatar? Right?
True.
Do people negotiate with Daesh? They don't. So why would you negotiate with someone like Daesh? So in fact, it delegitimizes the government of which you are the vice president. Just like Donald Trump wrote a book called The Art of the Deal, I don't know, Amrullah Saleh should probably write one called The Art of the Own Goal. So that is, that's the problem with calling to support the Afghan state, whilst also making these admissions about the Afghan state. Number 4.
Just before we go to number 4, okay, so supporting the Afghan state, what does that practically mean?
Supporting core state institutions, supporting civil society, aid and security assistance.
How? In what way? Okay, so
more
the hadith.
More aid.
You know the hadith that there is a hadith that says that you need to support the oppressor, and that the explanation of the hadith is that if your brother is an oppressor, supporting him means that you prevent him from committing more,
inflicting harm.
Yes. So here, that's the thing. We have to do now sharh of this text according to our Islamic teachings. So that you support these very corrupt institutions, okay? But they're not actually giving any recommendation how to support them, how to prevent more corruption, how to prevent...
It's mentioned anti-corruption measures very vaguely. And, the US should exercise pressure to do this. And it's essentially
and all of this
the same old.
So all of this needs now, in this short time span, after 20 years of waging war and state building and creating this whole system, now all of a sudden they come with this list of recommendation to do all these things that they haven't done in the last 20 years or failed to do in the last 20 years. Now they come with a whole new list of recommendations, how to support the state, how to fight corruption. Does this make any sense to any sensible and intelligent person?
No, it doesn't. It's like I said, the NDS, like you mentioned, alleged to have been a grave human rights abuser, human rights violator. Okay? So support the NDS, who will crush civil society activists, whilst we should also support civil society. I can't make sense of it. But anyways, we've gone over that. The thing is, Sangar, is that liberal arts students get taken the mick out of a lot. Rightfully so. They can be very annoying. But one thing that is really lacking in the world that I see it today is logic, basic logic, right? I am not arguing this from, a tribal Afghan lens or from the sensibilities of Islamic scholarship. Pure logic. Like, if you make an argument, it has to make logical sense. It should not have a gaping hole in it. You cannot say we should support the security apparatus while supporting civil society, even though one is accused of butchering the other. At the very least, you should say we should investigate these very serious allegations. Or the classic, the US is very concerned, just as it's very concerned about everything.
Okay. Proceed.
Now, number four, the report recommends to work diplomatically to promote the success of the negotiation process. I agree. I 100% think that the US should use pressure, should exert some sort of influence in order that these Afghan factions can come to some sort of mutual understanding and form a state. Okay? But what does the success of the negotiation process look like? Because in the first recommendation, it was to clarify the end state, the desired goal for the US, a democratic Afghanistan. If the negotiation is a success and it acknowledges, for example, Mawlawi Hibatullah Akhundzada as Amir al-Mu'mineen, attended to by a council of ministers, and that stops the war, that is a success. You can call that a success, but it's not democratic.
Yes.
Okay? So what does success look like? A lot of these words are being thrown about. They sound great. I agree with them 100%. But if this is a policy paper, you need to be specific. You need to define what is too close to Al-Qaeda. You need to define what is success. Number 5.
Wait.
The US.
Wait. Okay, before we proceed, to our listeners and viewers, what you're witnessing right now is something that hasn't been done in the last 20 years. A critical study of these documents that are published about Afghanistan, where important decisions are made by these recommendations, but nobody bothers to actually critically examine this document and see how document is full of flaws, contradictions, and basically sloganeering. And this is one of the reasons why we have created this podcast, and that this is one of the reasons why we have Afghan Eye. So without out of the way, 5.
It was a good point to make, to be honest. I don't mind being cut off. But number 5, the US should design an overarching regional diplomatic strategy. And in doing so, it should satisfy the neighbors of Afghanistan with an Afghanistan that is, and I quote directly, is at peace with itself and with others. does not allow its territory to be used for attacks on other countries, is not the venue for proxy warfare, is not the source of illicit narcotics or refugees, is economically interconnected with the region, has preserved gains made over the past 20 years. Okay, now first of all, Zalmay Khalilzad already did that. Okay? I don't disagree, desire the regional diplomatic thing and get all of Afghanistan's neighbors on board. To an extent, I think that's fine. I don't think they should take priority, but, that's a fair point to make. I'm not going to dispute it. Is not the venue for proxy warfare. The Afghanistan Study Group is saying that, we need to negotiate with the Taliban and, extend this deadline. The Taliban are, according to loads of parties, called a proxy group of Pakistan. I personally don't agree with that assessment of the Taliban, but you need to be once again, you need to be specific and clear. Define for us what is proxy warfare, okay, and how also can you bring neighbors on board when President Trump was subjecting Iran to 4 years of maximum pressure. Is not the source of illicit narcotics or refugees. Great. Is economically interconnected with the region. Has preserved gains over the past 20 years.
Oh.
Define those gains.
Like,
yeah.
Oh, whenever I see the whole gains mentioning by anyone, I like... It's like
I shut off. I just basically switch off.
It disgusts me because this whole idea of gains is based on the notion that before 2001, Afghanistan was basically a black hole. There was nothing. They were all savages. Like even recently, Ashraf Ghani's wife said that before my husband became president, people couldn't read or write, or it was himself. He said that. He said something like that. This is like...
He also said that he built Afghanistan.
Yes,
when he went to Paktia. Afghanistan Majorque.
The progression of Afghan society is not all dependent on the US invasion in 2001 and everything that is framed within that, gains is often based on that assumption that before 2001, you were just basically Neanderthals. You couldn't do anything. You couldn't read, write. You couldn't even walk straight. But then we came and we made you humans, and these gains...
And we built the American University of Afghanistan, and now look at you. Yeah. You're doing great, aren't you?
Yeah.
Another problem that I have with it, is that even if we look at the gains,
yes,
okay, and we'll discuss some of those in a bit, these gains, some of the ones that they're being talked about, there's no two ways to put this. A lot of these gains were attained at the cost of the blood of thousands of Afghans in an invasion that the US started with policy papers like this,
yes,
notoriously ill-defined, full of slogans, catering to ideological sensibilities, and referencing the wrong sorts of people in arriving at its conclusions. So this, those gains, a lot of those that were made were, they cost not just the money, they cost the blood of thousands of Afghans.
People were tortured, imprisoned, entire villages wiped off the map so that we can have these gains.
And the American University of Afghanistan and a couple of others, okay? But, so those are the 5 recommendations that the Afghanistan Study Group is making. And of course, this was all endorsed by Abdullah Saleh in a report that called his government corrupt 20 times. Essentially, if these recommendations were adopted, what would this cause? I want to brush through this. Now, we've already had the declarations and the statements made by Sher Mohammed Abbas Tanekzai and Zabiullah Mujahid, and they basically said, you renege on this deal we are back at war and we will kill Americans. And I also mentioned earlier that if it is on the basis of the Doha Deal, which stipulates the 2021 May final US troop withdrawal, that the Afghan government and the Taliban are negotiating, if the cornerstone of that agreement, which is the US troop withdrawal, is reneged upon, then the meaning or the purpose of the intra-Afghan negotiations becomes redundant. Because the Taliban, if you've looked at them over the years, the one thing they've been pretty consistent on is that they've said US troop withdrawal is the first thing we'll negotiate, and then we'll negotiate we'll negotiate with our fellow Afghans. So if the US troop withdrawal is thrown into jeopardy, that takes the Taliban back in their trajectory back to stage one, where their goal is to eliminate the presence of any US troop, any US soldier. Now, why would, for example, these suggestions be made? Because essentially, I mean, this is just this encouraging more war in Afghanistan. And the argument that was made for the inadvisable pathways to take was that if the US committed fully to the Afghan state, it would incentivize the Afghan state to not make concessions to the Taliban in a negotiating table. Well, the Afghan state can also deploy, quite an impressive PR machine. Every single time the Taliban does meet a condition, it can, the condition hasn't been defined. Therefore, it can be characterized or mischaracterized by a party opposed to the Taliban meeting that condition.
Just like they rely on NDS for the whole claim that the Taliban have not broken ties with Al-Qaeda.
Exactly. Because when you don't define things, they become subject to sort of being mischaracterized or whatever. Now, so the Afghanistan Study Group has a number of quite prominent people, Sangar. Why would they, essentially, we've covered the report, we've covered the ramifications of the report if it were enacted, why would they promote such a course of action such as this?
That's why we need to take a close look at who the authors are.
We do, because we're critiquing all of this work, we're criticizing it, we're praising it in some instances as well. We need to look at who the Afghanistan Study Group are. And the Afghanistan Study Group, like I said, established in December 2019, it has a number of members. It has 3 co-chairs. Okay, one of them is a Miss or Mrs. Kelly Ayotte. I don't know if I pronounced that name properly. But I think it's okay because she wouldn't be able to pronounce my name either. So that's fine. So Kelly Ayotte is an ex-US Republican senator for New Hampshire. She sits on the board of directors for BAE Systems, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, the United States Institute of Peace, and United Against Nuclear Iran, which is very interesting. And here comes another logical fallacy, Sangar. The report also, says that in discussing Iran, it says that Iran sees itself as a protector of Afghanistan's Shia population, which had been the target of Taliban persecution when the movement controlled Afghanistan in the late 1990s, and its long-standing connections with Shia leaders give it a certain prominence in Afghanistan's domestic politics. So Iran has close ties with Afghan Shia leaders, according to the report of which Miss Kelly Ayotte is, the co-chair of the organization. Now, the report is also stressing the importance of minority rights. Okay? Minority rights have been stressed upon a couple of times. Now, who are minorities in Afghanistan? Well, we're talking about ethnic minorities, but we're also talking about religious minorities. So Afghanistan's Shia population, according to the report, its leaders who represent it have close ties with Iran. At the same time, Ms. Kelly Ayotte was opposed to the Iran deal. She is literally on the board of directors of an organization essentially anti-Iranian. She said the Iran deal favored Iran over Israel. What's going on here? you're basically saying that and these are not my words, of course, Afghanistan's Shia leaders are close with Iran. I, as Kelly Ayot, absolutely despise Iran. But Afghanistan's Shia leaders should be given a certain level of prominence in Afghanistan's politics, thereby augmenting Iran's influence. It doesn't make sense. And also, to mention Kelly Ayot, she fought attempts by the Obama administration to try terrorism suspects in civilian federal courts, and she also opposed the closure of Guantanamo Bay detention camp. She even introduced a bill in the Senate that would block the closure of the prison. Quite a pleasant character. And, like I said, the most important part here, she sits on the board of directors for BAE Systems, which is one of the biggest military companies that sell military hardware in the world. Now, you remember when President Eisenhower said something about the military-industrial complex? It's looking us right in the eye over here. But that's not all, okay? Because we've also got Mr. Joseph Dunford. Now, Mr. Joseph Dunford is a co-chair of the Afghanistan Study Group. He's a retired United States Marine Corps 4-star general. And as Afghans, we have some exposure to him because he was the head of the US and NATO forces in Afghanistan. And then he assumed command of ISAF, which is the International Security Assistance Force. His current role, as he's retired from the army, is he sits on the board of directors for Lockheed Martin. Lockheed Martin is an arms company. And
just like BAE Systems.
I read an article. Just like BAE Systems, it's another arms company, and it's an arms company that was very prominent in essentially being given the contract for the F-35. Now, when the F-35 was questioned by the Pentagon, guess who was the one who stringently approved and advocated for using it despite questions of its effectiveness? It was Joseph Dunford. And I got that information from John Reynolds, who wrote an article about the military-industrial complex, basically striking back with this report. So what you have is, so far, 2 co-chairs of the Afghanistan Study Group are literally the military-industrial complex. Okay? One of them is on the board of directors of Lockheed Martin. The other is on BAE Systems. And Congress has commissioned these guys, the United States Congress has commissioned these guys to come up with policy recommendations for Afghanistan. Make of that what you will.
And the United States Institute for Study of Peace is financed by the military-industrial complex.
Oh yeah, because funnily enough, in the world within which we live, the United States Institute of Peace has a great relationship with one of the biggest arms companies in the world. Make of that what you will. Now, the third co-chair is a Miss or Mrs. Nancy Lindborg, who was also the ex-president of the United States Institute of Peace. She's currently serving as the president and CEO of the David and Lucille Packard Foundation. The foundation gives grants to non-profit organizations focused on conservation and science, children, families and communities, local grants making, and population and reproductive health. So,
to summarize it,
Nancy Lindborg is the CEO of a foundation that gives grants to organizations dedicated to reproductive health, amongst other things. Now, I did a bit of research here. The David and Lucille Foundation in 2017 gave $100,000 to an organization called Women for Afghan Women on the basis, and these aren't my words, this is on their website, on the basis of reproductive health. Okay? Now, Women for Afghan Women is an organization that sort of dedicates to protecting Afghan women, helping them, whatever. And it's also described itself as being culturally sensitive. Okay, it's been endorsed by the likes of Fawzia Koofi. Fawzia Koofi is currently a member of the negotiating team for the Afghan government in Qatar. She's a parliamentarian originally from Badakhshan, right?
From Kuf, yeah, in Badakhshan, and
from Badakhshan.
This is something most people in the Anglosphere don't know, but Fawzia Koofi the champion of women's rights. Her whole political career is sponsored by her infamous two brothers who are known in Afghanistan. They've even been arrested and prosecuted for, guess what? Drug trade. So she is like the sister of Pablo Escobar and what's the other guy? The one, the Chapo. Imagine that
El Chapo Guzman.
Yeah, imagine that the sister of El Chapo Guzman or Pablo Escobar enters politics to advocate for the interests of their, drug dealing brothers, and this person suddenly is endorsed by the entire world as the champion of women's rights, and she's invited everywhere to speak about women's rights. Well, in reality, if you know Afghanistan's politics and history, you know that this woman is in no way concerned with human rights or women's rights. She's...
Oh, come on, Sangar. Do strong women intimidate you? Why are you so intimidated by strong women?
Yeah.
But in any case, right? Whatever our reservations about Miss Fawzia Koofi may or may not be, she has explicitly endorsed Women for Afghan Women and said, and I quote, "Women for Afghan Women is the best organization in Afghanistan."
Yes.
Women for Afghan Women has also been endorsed by none other than our First Lady, Rola Ghani, who has said many around the world have expressed concern for the state of Afghan women. Some have initiated programs to address their problems and to alleviate their suffering, but very few have been able to tackle the situation with the understanding and dedication, the wisdom and the patience of Women for Afghan Women. Now, the work that Women for Afghan Women do, I can't personally talk about. I don't know much about them, but when it comes to empowering women, helping them to escape from abusive homes, provide them opportunities for their own livelihoods, that's fine. But the basis on which the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, which is the organization of which the co-chair of the Afghanistan Study Group is the CEO of, the David and Lucille Packard Foundation gave Women for Afghan Women $100,000 on the basis of reproductive health. Now, what is reproductive health? This isn't an educational podcast of that sort. But
basically,
reproductive health, we can talk about contraception, but contraception comes in many forms, some of which would be seen very disapprovingly in Afghanistan, and by that I mean abortion. Okay, so, and according to the Women for Afghan Women, in 2019, 3,013 individuals were provided with family guidance centers owned by Women for Afghan Women provided services to 3,013 Afghan women in 2019. What are those services?
Yeah,
I don't have an answer for you. That's from their website.
This is one major issue in Afghanistan with the whole providing aid and support for women's rights. It's that from a secular liberal progressive perspective, abortion is seen as a human right and to self-determination. But even here in Western societies, a lot of people disapprove of abortions because it is seen as murdering babies. Now, in Afghanistan, obviously, they cannot label everything as abortion, so they have all these, the words and descriptions to hide it.
It's also pretty telling that the Women for Afghan Women who provided these services, and I'm not saying services in a derogatory way, that is literally the euphemism or word that's used on the website. But Women for Afghan Women have actually described themselves as being culturally sensitive. Okay? So if they're being culturally sensitive and they're being very tight-lipped about what services they offer, I can't say for certain that they're offering abortions, but it's understandable that that's the conclusion to which some people will be led. So To wrap up, the ex-president of United States Institute for Peace is the CEO of a foundation that in 2017 gave $100,000 to Women for Afghan Women, which is endorsed by Fawzia Koufi and Rula Ghani, which provides services in family guidance centers and family counseling. And it did that to 3,013 women in 2019. So that is Miss Nancy Lindborg covered. Another member, just for example, and this I also got from John Reynolds, is a man called Stephen Hadley. Stephen Hadley is a former Bush administration official. He owns shares worth more than $2.4 million in Raytheon. Raytheon is, they describe themselves, a technology and innovation leader specializing in defense, national security, and other government and commercial markets around the world. So essentially, another one of the members of the Afghanistan Study Group is Stephen Hadley, who has $2.4 million worth of shares in an arms company. There are other members of the group. There are quite a few. One of them is David Miliband, who was the ex-foreign minister of Britain. But yeah, so what we're looking at here, you see, Sangar, in Afghanistan, we would call this corruption. Okay? Rishwat, fasad-e-idari. In America, this is called networking. Okay? This is business. But what we have here is, even in the English language, we have a phrase called conflict of interest. Okay? There is a clear conflict of interest here. What a conflict of interest means, for those people that don't know, is that you are appointed or you are carrying out work in one role in which you have an incentive, an interest to work towards a specific capacity. That is, if you are Stephen Hadley, you are, because you own $2.4 million of shares in an arms company, there is an incentive to push forward policies that would promote war, because that means greater profits for your arms company. And if you are Kelly Ayotte, you are sitting in the board of directors of BAE Systems. BAE Systems profits from war. If you are Joseph Dunford, you're sitting on the board of directors of Lockheed Martin. Lockheed Martin benefits from war. And if you are Nancy Lindborg, you kind of have somewhat of a intellectual, ideological interest in perpetuating a Western presence in Afghanistan, because your organization, of which you are the CEO, provides funding for other organizations on the ground to provide services. What those services are, we would say.
When a person like Nancy Lindborg is involved in this whole project with Joseph Dunford and Kelly Ayotte and Hadley, it basically means that this is the entire, the elite of the military-industrial complex and this ideological strand that is also involved in endless wars and occupations. And it needs to be critiqued. You have this whole cabal of Afghanistan experts and Afghanistan journalists and researchers and analysts who all basically tap on each other's shoulders and approvingly refer to one another on social media, like, oh, this person is so great, he has said this and he has said that. But none of these people have bothered to go further and basically study these people, investigate who are these people who are publishing this report, and is there a conflict of interest? Nobody does that. Why not? For the last 20 years, Afghanistan has been occupied. People have been bombed on daily basis. People are still imprisoned and people are being tortured. Guantanamo is still open. There are still prisoners there. All of this is...
Much to Kelly Ayotte's delight.
Yes, all of this is still happening. And we have now 2 generations of Afghan, academics and educated Afghans. And we have all these non-Afghan people involved in Afghanistan's current affairs, in the media and academia. But none of these people are addressing this issue. Why? What's the problem? What are they scared of? And why is this issue not being addressed? It's something that somebody needs to do this. Somebody needs to take the responsibility and somebody needs to stick out their neck and address these issues, and that's what we are here for.
The one highlight in the last few decades has been this peace agreement, because it's actually meant that Afghans can negotiate with each other. The people that are putting forth these recommendations clearly, as we demonstrate, have massive conflicts of interest. Okay? And these are the people upon whose advice the US acts upon. People that cannot define what closeness means, what success means, what compromised political settlement means, what democracy means. They cannot define any of these. They can instead use slogans like gains of the last 2 decades, or just talk about terrorism and whatever generically. We don't have that conflict of interest. Despite the accusations, there is no state industry that supports us. We are entirely freelancers. Everything I have got here, from this microphone to the software, to the things that we've rebooted our website with, it's all thanks to our Patreons. And the reason we're doing it is because people need to know what kind of people are perpetuating these policies in Afghanistan. They're not ordinary people like you and I. They are people at the very top with $2.4 million of shares in arms companies. That needs to be discussed. That needs to be known. It needs to be talked about. And now we'll wrap that part up, and we'll just go to some quotes. So, for example, Sangar, this is just to vindicate what you said earlier about your female relatives working in schools. So, there's a quote, and I quote directly. Still, Afghan women have achieved a great deal since the fall of the Taliban government, even as insecurity, underdevelopment, and patriarchal norms continue to limit their rights and opportunities in much of the country. These achievements are remarkable given that under the Taliban there were no female judges, prosecutors, or defense attorneys, no women in the media or security forces, no girls or female teachers in formal schools, and only a few female healthcare providers. Well, we pretty much know that there were girls' schools operating in the Taliban era at a very limited capacity, but it's incorrect to assert, quite frankly, that was a matter of uniform policy. Another thing that this one made me laugh, Sangar. Elections, the report describes the elections that Afghanistan has held as flawed. And there's another quote that says, and I quote directly, "Corruption, fraud, and mismanagement have undermined people's confidence in electoral institutions, yet although recent elections have provoked political crises, none escalated into a violent clash. Elite accommodation was achieved in all cases, and with US diplomatic intervention, the country witnessed the first democratic and constitutional transition of power in 2014. A flawed election would be something like East Anglia being flooded in a British general election and people not being able to vote. This quote that says, recent elections provoked political crises, none of which escalated into a violent clash. That's not a flawed election. Saying that, yes, the elections were flawed, but at least we managed to stop a civil war, that's not an achievement. That's a pretty damning... These people are from the US. They know what a mature democracy looks like, a mature democracy that's evolved since American independence. It's stable. There aren't armed takeovers of power. These people are saying that we prevented a civil war, so the democracy is flawed. That democracy is not flawed. It's dead. Literally, it's dead, especially in 2014 when you make extra constitutional posts like chief executive officer to basically placate people to stop them from going to civil war.
Our First Lady Rula Ghani, her position is also not based on the constitution. Basically, this government, after its fraudulent elections, have now a chief executive officer and a first lady. Both of them are not part of the constitution that was bestowed upon us by this post-2001 regime.
Now, there's another quote on women, and this one I actually agree much of it with, as in terms of it being positive. So, Female enrollment public schools rose from 0 in 2001 to over 3 million in 2010. In 2019, millions of women had voted. 89 of Parliament's 352 members were women. Women held 13 seats as ministers and deputy ministers, and 4 served as ambassadors. 8 women served as deputy governors, mayors, deputy mayors, including 2 as district governors. Schools and universities employed nearly 80,000 women instructors, 10 including over 2,000 university professors. More than 6,000 women served as judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and army and police personnel. 8,500 women served amongst the country's health professionals. Female journalists numbered more than 1,000, and nearly 1,500 women entrepreneurs had invested a total of 77.5 million in their businesses. Life expectancy from 45.5 years in 2001 to 54.4 years. Life expectancy rose that much, and the literacy rate climbed from 13% in 2000 to 30% in 2018. Now, that is excellent. With the exception of billions of dollars later, the life expectancy for women has increased by just under 10 years. That's shocking. Okay. And secondly, it's 89 Parliament. That's like, it's the investment versus the result. Billions of dollars went into this, and women's life expectancy barely rose by less than 10 years. We still have the highest infant mortality rates, the highest rates of mothers dying during childbirth. 54.4 years is shocking, but it's better than any progress is better than no progress, right? But when there are hundreds of billions of dollars to account for, I can't say that with a smile on my face.
Listen, just 1 second. Okay, so we have all these people from the military-industrial complex involved in this report, yes? We know how much money is invested in the military aspect of occupation of Afghanistan. And we have this Lindborg person who is involved in Women for Afghan Women, and they are supposedly helping Afghan women. They are supposedly there to take care of Afghan women. How about asking these people, where are the proportionalities? Like, women are still in Afghanistan. They have all these problems and issues that are also mentioned in this report. And we see the proportion of the money that is being invested in bombs and prison cells and drones and whatnot. So obviously, we see that there is a clear contradiction. That human rights, women's rights, clearly mean very little in terms of dollars.
And another point I would raise with regard to women, the progress, like I said, I'm delighted about the progress. Okay, anyone would be delighted about the progress, despite the fact that hundreds of billions of dollars should have yielded much more, but fine, we'll take it. My point of contention, and I mentioned this in the previous podcast where we were reviewing Barnett Rubin's book, representation. Okay, 13 women deputy ministers and ministers, 4 ambassadors, deputy governors, all of that. I do not believe at all for 1 second that the common Afghan woman is uplifted because a government has decided to nominate another woman to which the standard Afghan woman has no sort of relation. I do not believe that uplifts Afghan women. Just as I don't believe that making Muhaqqiq the cultural and political advisor to Ashraf Ghani uplifts Hazaras in Besud. That's just, appointing people at the top. It's, trickle-down economics or trickle-down representation is not something that I'm a fan of. And
with regards to women, see, they are mentioning that the number of women in government, there is an increase. However, what is not being explained here is that the amount of money donated to the Afghan government is tied to these matters. So the more women the government appoints in significant roles, the more donations they will receive. So the incentive for the Ashraf Ghani government to appoint women is to get more money. And as a result, you see that women are appointed to all kinds of jobs when those women obviously don't have any qualification. Like there are women who don't have a military background or any kind of administrative background.
There are men that have no military backgrounds that are currently national security advisors.
Yes, we have a someone with a PhD in graphic design who is national security advisor. So it's representation for the computer nerds, but I don't think that will actually benefit security in Afghanistan. Likewise, if you are going to just incentivize a corrupt government to appoint women in visible roles, obviously they will appoint a lot of women everywhere, but that doesn't mean that anything changes. They just want the money. That's it.
And the final thing the final quote I would discuss is, and I quote, "Since the 1920s, regimes in Kabul have maintained, revised, and reinvented the constitutional model of governance while emphasizing the Islamic character of the state. In that sense, the restoration of a republican form of government in 2001 meant a return to a number of the institutional designs and habits of Afghanistan's political past, rather than the imposition of a foreign model of rule." Well, if night raids are being carried out in which the Afghan government has no oversight in who, what, where these, who are being affected by these, that looks like a foreign model of rule. If the Afghan government can only survive by ticking boxes and fulfilling the quotas set arbitrarily by the United Nations or the United States, that is a foreign model of rule. And if all of the political leaders are those that were handpicked by the US and gathered together, despite their bloody past fighting each other, they gathered together for the sake of national unity or more likely self-interest, that is a foreign model of rule. And finally, if the US negotiates with the Taliban directly without negotiating with the Afghan government, which claims to be the representative, legitimate government of Afghanistan, that is a foreign model of rule. And I think I'm done, Sangar.
I think we have basically fulfilled our promise when we said we are going to critically examine this document.
You can either read the report, 88 pages of it, and it will take you a lot more than 2 hours, like I did. You can either go off the social media frenzies and, all of the mudslinging and the name calling and whatever that's going on there, or you could listen to our podcast. You'll understand the good parts of the report, the bad parts, the ambiguities of it, the conflicts of interest, and that's what I would say.
Okay, on that note, we're going to wrap this up.
Okay, guys, thank you. For those that made it to the end of the podcast, right? It was long. It was pretty detailed. There were a lot of quotes there, but the reason that was the case is because, quite frankly, 88 pages cannot be condensed into simple sound bites. These issues are complex. One of the main problems that I have, and I always express it, is the descent of, what are supposed to be scholarly discussions into sound bites. I'm not someone that does that. Sangar isn't someone that does that. In order to dissect 88 pages to let you know who is promoting these kinds of policies, why they're promoting this kind of policies, and what policies are they actually implementing and promoting, well, we took it upon ourselves to do that. No one else is doing it. These are the kinds of people that were allowed to get away with writing whatever they wrote for the last 20 years. But now, alhamdulillah ta'ala, we are here. And we're going to continue, bifadlillahi ta'ala, to continue to do our work. And in doing so, we need to be allies with each other. We enlighten and provide you with a different perspective, a critical perspective and analysis. You guys need to support us. The support we've received so far, couldn't be more grateful for it. The only complaint that I do have is, come on, man, leave us a review on the on the audio streaming platforms. But in any case, once again, thank you very much. We are researching different topics and we will be active and around. So, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa ta'ala wa barakatuh. My God, I'm tired. I even managed to mess that up.